Hello, today I'm continuing my look at the Tekken series, with a look at the enduring and enigmatic individuals that comprise the character of King. Now, King is a fascinating inclusion to the Tekken games for a number of reasons, and while he's not a prominent central character to the standard of a Kazuya or a Heihachi, he is certainly one of the more notable secondary figures alongside the likes of Paul Phoenix, Yoshimitsu and Nina Williams. And aside from being two individuals appearing under the moniker of King, like these aforementioned characters, some form or iteration of King has featured in every mainline Tekken game. So I find King fascinating because he's another of these characters who straddles the realms of reality with the inherently unreal and improbable, because he's a luchador wrestler who, in keeping with the traditions of Mexican wrestling, and something that was later popularised in Japanese wrestling, which may account for his early inclusion in Tekken, he wears an ostentatious mask to conceal his identity. However, rather than the conventional lucha mask, it is quite literally a figurative jaguar's head, and indeed his Player 1 costume, through most of the Tekken titles, comes complete with a jaguar's tail, and he also communicates, and his sound effects comprise of growling sound effects too. So King, much like the motley of improbable characters like Yoshimitsu or Jack, requires a slight suspension of disbelief in what might otherwise be considered a realistic fighting game with realistic fighting styles, but he ultimately fits brilliantly into the accepted reality and style of the Tekken series. And something quite interesting and telling about his character is way back in Tekken 1, in the introduction, we see King donning the mask, and it has these transformative properties to his costume. So I really like how, much like the luchadors and even the masked warriors going all the way back to the Vikings and the Romans, who sought to imbue themselves with the properties and the strengths of gods and beasts, this very much carries over into the aesthetics of King, and his character has captured some of this magical realism with this transformative mask, and ultimately is yet another excellent example of the unique visual design, moveset and aesthetic that is present in the Tekken games. And just another note on his visual design and narrative beyond the mask. There's always been a thing for masked wrestlers in Japan, which was inherited from the Mexican style, and one of the most popular to appear in Japanese wrestling over the years was a guy called Tiger Mask, who, much like the King of Tekken, was actually made up of several individuals over time. I think there was 2 or 3 of them. And not only did Tiger Mask take a similar big cat for his aesthetic and his image, but much like King in Tekken, his costumes often comprised of blue tights or purple tights with yellow and gold flourishes. So I always felt there was a strong homage to this popular wrestler apparent in King, and if you are inclined, I would definitely recommend looking up Tiger Mask, and particularly Tiger Mask versus the Dynamite Kid matches from the 1980s, because not only is it catch wrestling at its very best, but you can also see a lot of the manoeuvres that make their way into King's moveset as well, so I feel like there is a very strong parallel between these two characters. Now, turning to storyline, I find that King is very comparable to other prominent secondary characters and legacy characters that I've recently discussed, such as Nina Williams. The reason being is that beneath the central Mishima story, he has had a consistent narrative thread that propels him along, that doesn't necessarily inch into the main plot, and with characters such as Heihachi or Kazuya, but it still sustains his relevance within Tekken, and he operates in the orbit of other equally important secondary characters. And where Nina Williams has Anna, and later Steve Fox, as her immediate foils, King, and later King II, has Armor King II, and Craig Marduk as his immediate foils, which gives each of these characters relevance and stake for featuring in each Tekken tournament. And rooting back to Tekken 1, and again, like Nina Williams before him, King's most prominent foil in the series has been his sub-boss, Armor King. And back in Tekken 1, as most of the sub-bosses were, he was little more than a palette swap for the mainline King. And we saw this with Lee Chaolan, who was a palette swap for Martial Law, Anna Williams, who was a palette swap for Nina Williams, and so on. And this has later sort of branched out, and from Tekken 2 onwards, the sub-boss and Armor King, along with the other sub-bosses, grew to develop their own unique aesthetic, moveset, and storyline. But what I love about King, and also Armor King, is that, like Yoshimitsu, who I've discussed in the past, At face value, they have quite a menacing and potentially villainous vibe about them, but they are in fact among the very few genuinely good-natured individuals to appear in a Tekken game, and among the Tekken cast. And from the outset, their rivalry stems from King having blinded Armor King in one eye in some long-ago match, which later fosters into a friendship and a partnership. And this carries over to Armor King overseeing and training King II's career, which we see at the end of Tekken 3, for example. So there's a very interesting lineage and interrelationship between these various King characters. Now, King's main raison d'etre for entering the tournament to begin with is to raise money to build an orphanage for disadvantaged children, which is one of the more selfless storylines that we witness in the original Tekken. And he began as something as quite a sincere and tragic character, and we witnessed, or at least we glimpsed in the small cutscenes, his struggles with alcoholism and so on, and his reliance on Armor King to bring him back to wrestling, and indeed his faith to save himself. And I think this was beautifully communicated, most poignantly by his stage and his theme, Ring a Bell in Tekken 2, which has a real bittersweetness to it, and I thought that was a great atmosphere. And this persisted until Tekken 3, where, like many characters I've discussed on the channel, we saw a dramatic shift in the character roster in favour of a new generation of fighters and characters. And while a handful, such as Paul Phoenix and Heihachi, were aged up, and others would depart to return in later games, such as Bake or Bruce Irvin, King, who was already among the oldest characters in Tekken at this point, because he was 30 years old in Tekken 1, he is one of the very few characters to actually be killed off and written out entirely, as he was killed by Ogre. And so, much like the wrestling gimmicks and the wrestling families of Mexico and Japan, the mantle and the mask was inherited by a former student, an orphan, and so King II enters Tekken 3, the tournament, in his stead. And like many others, such as Hwoarang, who replaced Bake as a Taekwondo practitioner, the series was able to persist with this younger, fresher generation of fighters. And so it was down to King II to inherit the role, and I think he slotted in really well among these other characters. And it's worth noting that the same thing occurred with Armor King later on, as he was replaced by his younger brother. So again, very interesting sense of lineage here, and really the symbolism and the character is the mask itself, and what the mask embodies and means to these various individuals that take it up and wear it. And I think it echoes real-world wrestling dynasties like the Guerrero family or the Hart family, where the name lives on and it means a lot to these guys. And in Tekken specifically, it's created an intriguing thread of subplots with these legacy Tekken characters. And now we have Craig Marduk entering the fold, because he was the guy that killed the first Armor King, and yet the younger brother, Armor King, who remains enigmatic and unknown, has a persistent kind of revenge arc going on with Marduk specifically, and to a lesser extent King. And at the time of Tekken 7's closure, in keeping with Mexican wrestling traditions, there is an anticipated showdown between Armor King and Marduk in a mask and retirement match, which again, they hold these in Mexico, and basically the loser, or if Armor King loses, he must remove his mask to reveal his identity and retire. So there's a lot of significance, and there's a lot of real-world elements from the wrestling world that's been brought into this story, which I quite like. So there we have it, some top-level thoughts on King's design, story, and evolution across the Tekken series. And where the first King started off as this tragic and noble character, the second King has persisted along this line and become more involved with the arcs of other characters, such as Armor King. So some may feel he's taken a back seat compared to his predecessor, but nonetheless very aesthetically interesting. And despite being made up of a couple of individuals, the idea and the concept of the enigmatic man behind the Jaguar mask remains another of Tekken's outstanding legacies in character design. And many people, including my younger brother, were immediately drawn to the character of King from the beginning of the series, and they continue to love his unique appeal, his unique moveset of catch wrestling and chain grappling that makes him such an intriguing playstyle and difficult opponent when he's used adequately. So if you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, and drop a comment below to let me know your thoughts on King.